Welcome to the Sounds of Resistance channel. The raids of the Ukrainian armed forces in the northeast completely disrupted the army order, astonishing the Russian army. The pressure of the Ukrainian armed forces on Kherson was forgotten and the Russian army had to run its eyes on the north. But this was the beginning of a complete collapse for the Russian army. The Ukrainian army has been hitting Russian army targets in the Kherson region for months, and the Russian forces in the region have been severely weakened. In the last week, the Ukrainian armed forces smashed the Russian army in Kherson. The Ukrainian armed forces, which entered the Russian army line for about 80 kilometers, seized the great opportunity to liberate Kherson region. The Kremlin, on the other hand, may give up on Kherson, albeit partially, considering the heavy losses in Kherson. Military experts think that the Kremlin will not be able to withstand the consequences of heavy losses. The Kremlin administration, unable to withstand the call from the proxies in Kherson and the pressure of the Ukrainian army in the siege of Kherson, began to evacuate the Russians and soldiers from Kherson. In Kherson, the Russian army's attempt to evacuate its military officers, and its families and civilians by accepting the defeat causes groupings in the Kremlin. While Kadyrov and Wagner PMC boss bring up the inhumane attacks on Ukraine, Kremlin officials are calling for an orderly withdrawal and an end to the war. Apparently, the Russian authorities, against the background of the offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces, limited communication with the occupied territory of Ukraine. The so-called deputy governor of the annexed Kherson region, Vladimir Saldo, was forced to write an appeal to the leadership of the Russian Federation with a request for help in organizing the evacuation of the partners of the occupation administration. He asked Moscow to help with exports to the Crimea, Rostov region, Krasnodar and Stavropol territories. He cited the threat of missile attack as the reason for the evacuation. It should be noted that a week ago, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that representatives of the Kherson occupation administration began to take their families to the Crimea. At the same time, Saldo previously announced that the Crimea, Krasnodar and Stavropol territories are ready to accept children and their parents from the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. It was claimed that each region could house 10,000 people. Since the beginning of October, the Ukrainian armed forces has mobilized ground operations and regained much of the territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces raised the Ukrainian flag over the Davydovo Brod settlement, which has been in conflict for about 2 months. The Kremlin is trying to develop a different move against this. Russia said on Thursday that its forces will assist in the evacuation of occupied Kherson residents to other areas while continuing to make gains in Kiev's offensive to retake the southern Ukrainian region. The statement by Russian Deputy Prime Minister Marat Kushnulin comes shortly after Vladimir Saldo, head of the Moscow-backed administration in Kherson, appealed to the Kremlin to keep residents out of danger in the latest indication that Russian forces are fighting in the area. The Ukrainian army is conducting a counteroffensive in Kherson and the eastern regions of the country, hitting and retaking critical infrastructure such as bridges and railways, as well as the territory occupied by Russia. Saldo claimed that cities in Kherson, one of 4 Ukrainian territories that Russia claims to have annexed in violation of international law, have been hit by dangerous airstrikes. Saldo said that the local Russian leadership decided to organize the possibility of travel of Kherson families to other parts of the Russian Federation. Clashes in Kherson have intensified in recent weeks as Kiev continues to advance in Russia's goal of reclaiming territories it had recaptured in the early days of the invasion. US and Ukrainian officials said last month that they hope to get all of Kherson back by the end of the year. We know how critical Kherson is. Kherson is currently targeted as the key to Crimea, and if Kherson falls into the hands of Ukraine again, Crimea will become much more fragile if the Ukrainian armed forces gets this close to Russia's safest port, Crimea. As you may remember, Russian President Vladimir Putin started to hit many cities in Ukraine with his missiles right after the alleged Kerch Bridge attack by the Ukrainian armed forces. Even this move by Vladimir Putin shows how serious Crimea is to Putin. As of last week, Ukraine said it had recaptured 2,400 square kilometers in Kherson, which was formerly under Russian control. Officials in Kiev said on Wednesday that the Ukrainian army had liberated 5 more small rural villages as it advanced to the southwest. As Ukrainian forces advanced rapidly, Saldo appealed to Russian leaders to help Russian-backed local authorities move civilians. But Kirill Stremusov, deputy head of the military administration of the Kherson region, said that civilian transports are not an evacuation. There is not and cannot be evacuation in the Kherson region, he said in a statement. Stremusov openly criticized the decision-makers of the war in Moscow and on the battlefield. Last week, he blamed inadequate commanders for military failures in Kherson, who were not held accountable for their mistakes. On Thursday, Stremusov insisted that Saldo only asked the authorities to help organize the departure of residents of the Kherson region for temporary stay and rest in other parts of the Russian Federation. At the same time, it is reported that the other reason for the major disruption in Russian supplies to the region is Western sanctions. The Russian military has lost 6,000 pieces of equipment since its invasion of Ukraine in February and is wasting munitions at a rate that Western sanctions cannot replace, as it harms Moscow's defense industry, according to a newly released report from the US government. According to the report, the United States also began to detect critical supply shortages for Russia's diesel engines, helicopter and aircraft engine parts, and armored tanks in early May. Moscow is also having trouble making sales to foreign armies. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the United States has focused its efforts on 2 fronts. It seeks to provide substantial military aid to Ukraine and to harm Russia economically through broad sanctions and export controls. Russia's ability to manufacture advanced precision weapons was already undermined by export controls, which limited Russia's access to advanced technology. Western sanctions have also created shortcomings in less sophisticated technologies. For example, according to a US government report, Russia is suffering from a bearing shortage, which undermines the manufacture and repair of tanks, aircraft, submarines, and other military systems. The United States is seeking other so-called choke point technologies, such as ball bearings or fasteners, that could further hamper production of military supplies, according to a senior official who spoke to discuss the report's findings on condition of anonymity. In order to circumvent sanctions, Russian intelligence services were instructed to illegally acquire Western technology and parts, the report said. Russia has also turned to countries such as Iran and North Korea, which largely operate outside the international economic system and are also under Western sanctions for supplies. The United States has since imposed sanctions on Iranian companies that make and transport drones purchased by Russia for use in Ukraine. As the Ukrainian forces focus their attacks on ammunition depots, it is on the agenda for the international coalition to find ways to prevent Russia from producing more ammunition, the senior American official said. If these sanctions are implemented, not only the president but also the future of Russia will be in danger, and the Russian army will not be able to heal its wounds. It is considered a great shame for the Kremlin that the Russian army accepted the heavy defeat in Kherson and evacuated the civilians and Russian military officers and so-called government officers from Kherson. This situation causes groupings and conflicts in the Kremlin. While many bureaucrats in the Kremlin are discussing the possibility of peace negotiations, Kadyrov and Wagner patron are talking about much more severe attacks. While the situation definitely hurts Putin and his regime heavily, the Ukrainian warriors continue on their way without slowing down for their sole purpose. Thanks for watching.